Welcome back, everybody. Once again, you're listening to the Entrepreneurial. Sorry, it's my first one for the year, for the decade. We had a couple weeks off. I didn't have to say that. It's funny, like language is like, we were just talking about immersion, and like I find when I'm teaching a class, when I'm teaching martial arts, I teach martial arts often. When I take a little break, like there was no class for the kids for a couple weeks, and then I came back last week and started teaching, and I'm starting to say my stuff, and it's like I said this 1,000 times, and I was like, whoa. And I'm like, what's the matter with my tongue? Like, what's going on? So it's like you really have to practice the language, which I've learned because I spoke decent Spanish for a while, but now I live in suburban Brooklyn and just don't have to anymore. But like when I was working in restaurants in the city, like that was it. You spoke Spanish or you got nothing, at a number of them. And like now I'm like, I don't ever have to, and so my tongue is like, it's like lazy. So sorry about that. Let's try that again. Rewind, wheel it up. Welcome back, everybody. You're listening to the Entrepreneurial Web. I'm your host, Jeremiah Fox, here with my guest, Joanne Derwin. What's up, Barbara? How are you? Good to see you. Hope you're having a good new year. If you're upstate, I hope you're enjoying it. Hopefully you have a little snow. It's been remarkable here, the weather right now. It's like really 50 degrees today. Warm. Love it. It's great. So yes, back to our conversation about immersion and how that can really it just arms you for, it's almost like your back is against the wall. Like that's where often the saying pressure makes diamonds, you're either going to crumble and just literally die or not survive, or you're going to rise to the situation. So for you, your situation being just dropped off, parachuted into Spain. Yeah. But what could you say? Manchego? Hola? No, I could say you had to work it out. Like they didn't speak English, you didn't speak Spanish, and you had to, you just had to do it, and you had to rely. I love what you were saying about more than just learning Spanish. You learned how to be welcoming and open-armed about human communication, human interaction, which is gigantic. First of all, just for the human race, if we're going to survive, if we're going to pull this thing off, forget about being environmentally just. If we're just going to coexist, a good amount of that has to happen, and more of it than what's currently happening. And it's just such a huge part of communication besides your words. It's facial expressions, body gestures, and that's a big one. I think just being open-armed and just welcoming just changes the dynamic of everything. So if you're listening and you're a business operator or you want to open your own business, write that one down. You can't be crossing your arms like I am right now and be no, I'm not going to do this. Most of the time you have to be very open and welcoming if you want to get things done.
Yeah, and authentic, right? And vulnerable. And
oh my God, vulnerable.
Put yourself out there.
And you were so vulnerable, right? You were just I know nothing. I'm just knocking you back in the woods. You're just
naively, right? I didn't even.
Well, sure. I mean we can all trick ourselves and tell ourselves we know so much, but we're all really naive most of the time. I have no fucking clue what's going to happen. But
I was definitely very naive at 20 when I went to contact the first time.
Huge. That's I mean, now is not the time to do it, right? When you have children and businesses to run and stuff. You still have to be a little naive. You have to be humble, but that was the time. Yeah. But I think that's amazing that you did that and just did it in the fashion that you did. Just I don't know, let's just go. Let's
figure it out.
Yeah. There's a certain story of resilience that people need in general, just in general, depression rates are high and all this stuff. Resilience, I think, needs to be talked about a lot more. And how do you get that? Just by immersing yourself in this environment that nothing about, and being vulnerable and be willing to be taken care of a little bit, and knowing you're not going to pull this off alone. You're going to need help. What does that require? It requires patience, and it requires giving, and all the things that you had to experience as a 20-year-old living in another country. But I'm sure you could say you've had to rekindle a lot of that, starting, businesses and some of your accomplishments as of late, which we can get to a little more further on. I'd like for you to just talk a little bit more about your experience in Spain and how that interaction with the people there really changed your thinking as a young person, and somebody who was you had this desire to do something for people and to do something, you wanted to give in a way. You got this lesson. Can you talk more about that and how it affected you?
Sure. I mean, I didn't anticipate how important my experience in Spain would be for who I would become. Nor did I realize how powerful it is to go to another country and to learn another language in that immersion type of environment.
France wasn't available.
So that's the thing. I didn't want to learn French. I wanted to learn.
You already knew French, though.
Well, no, I mean, I didn't know French. That's the irony. It's like I grew up all taking weekly French classes,
right.
But in that pretty horrible language learning experience that
the mid-Atlantic 1980s and 90s.
No, it was like worksheets,
no,
verb conjugation. There was like a thing that the teacher would turn over when we could only speak French.
Right.
He was also like maybe the basketball coach. I mean, he was from somewhere in the United States. He didn't speak French very well.
Last name was Smith. Something like that.
Yeah. So I didn't know much French. I mean, I think I could read and write better than I could speak French.
Right.
And then I went to Spain, and after just 3 months, I was really felt comfortable and confident speaking in Spanish, and less so reading and writing, because the experience I learned in Spanish was like the lived language.
Yeah.
And I learned, I mean, I didn't know much about Spanish history or Spanish art, and to learn that while living there. So I remember on one weekend trip, a friend and I decided to go find an El Greco painting that we had studied in art history class. So we took a bus, we went to this little town, hours and hours and hours away, found the church where it was.
This was another American friend?
Another American friend, yeah.
So really setting out there.
And we found it. And it was one of those like magical experiences. Like, there it is. There's this piece of art that we had studied. We learn the history, we know the background, and to see it in real life.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then to make friendships with other Americans that have that shared experience. And that was my friend Lauren, who is still one of the people.
Right. Those bonds never break, right?
Most about. And yeah, exactly. Those bonds never break. And we set when my husband and I were married, we put her on the table next to my friend from college in the hopes that they would get together, and now they're married and they have 2 kids. And so anyway, that's a lot of fun.
I'm assuming you met Jaime in Spain.
I did. Yeah. So
wouldn't that be ironic?
Yeah. So, I mean, I do say that, like, I fell in love with Spain first, and then, and sort of I wanted to find someone who loved me as much as I love Spain initially. And then when I went back to school, finished on time, as I promised my parents, and graduating, I was like, what am I going to do with my life? It's that really scary moment of all that infrastructure that you have as a young person, you don't have any longer. And even if I was living in Boulder, my parents were in Maryland, but I still had a whole system of friends and support at the University of Colorado. So I thought about moving home, and then a friend from high school calls and she says, "Why don't we just move to Spain?" I was like, "Well, that's a good idea." So we went back to Alicante, and we both lived with just people we met. There was at like the market had like, we're looking for someone to rent a room. So I rented a room with one house, and she rented a room in another house, in the hope and expectation that we would continue to practice our Spanish and not only speak English to one another. And we started teaching English classes.
Nice.
And Armando and Cynthia were also incredibly helpful. And again, I grew up next to a horse farm, not far from a horse farm. And one time in Alicante, I saw a sign that said Pony Club, Poni. So I called, and I was like, I know about horses, but I don't know the vocabulary in Spanish about horses, but I'll figure it out.
Yeah.
So they gave me a job at this pony club, and I taught little Spanish children about horseback riding. And then I would learn.
There's a lot of like, siéntate.
It was like, no, I would learn
That's
things
all you
like,
need to know.
dale fusta, which means like hit it with the whip.
Oh, yeah.
So,
I know that one.
So, yeah. So, and I learned things like how to say elbows, like bend your elbows before probably in normal conversation. I wouldn't have learned
Yeah,
that.
right. Exactly.
So that was, a wonderful experience. And the other thing I did while I was back in Spain was I did the Camino de Santiago with Armando and his family and a group of about 15 or 16 Americans. We did 100 kilometers, so not the whole Camino, from León, which is where his family is from, to Santiago de Compostela. And we walked and walked and walked and had lots of blisters. And he would be like, no, have wine. You should have wine and then your feet won't hurt. So we had wine and we had clara and we had delicious cheese.
Right. Wine and cheese. That's it.
Yeah.
You're fine.
We were fine.
Keep walking.
Yeah. So on the Camino, I met 2 Americans. And afterwards, we're like, let's go to Barcelona together. So we went to Barcelona. And I had been there one time before. And so I was sort of pretending like a little bit like new friends, showing off a little bit. I was like, don't worry. Come with me to the taxi.
And you guys got robbed.
No. And we got into the taxi and I was like, Al Puerto, like take us to, I thought they were taking us to the Olympic port full of like all the discos. But instead he took us to El Puerto where all the boats are parked.
Yeah.
So we got out and I was sort of like humbled. I really know nothing about Barcelona. And we had a gigantic map out. And Jaime asked if we needed directions. So that's the story of how we met.
Fantastic.
And when he gets mad at me, he always says, I should have kept walking. So that's.
Oh, I have those stories too. Yeah.
So yeah, we met there.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And your degree, from Boulder, what exactly was that in?
It's called environmental studies.
Okay. So
yeah.
So you continued along that trajectory.
Yeah.
Nice.
And then I came back. I really loved teaching when I was in Spain. And so went back to Boulder and sort of checked in with my professors and told them that I had this great experience in Spain. I taught English and I loved teaching. And they were like, don't do it. Don't, you don't understand. The people you were teaching in Spain wanted to learn.
Yeah.
That's not going to be your experience.
You're not going to get that here.
They
were like, don't teach. You should open a school instead. That's probably
no, but I've always been sort of, but really, I loved teaching. But I also really respected them and I felt like they knew who I was.
And were they referring
profoundly.
to like taking a teaching gig in the States, like Department of Ed?
Yeah, I wanted to go back and get like a teaching degree and then be an elementary school teacher or a high school teacher.
Right. And they were like, you'll hate it.
No, don't do that. They were like very against.
Probably the best advice you got. Cool. We're going to take another break. We'll move on to the next hurdle, the next country and situation when we get back. You're listening to the Entrepreneurial Web. We'll talk to you in a few.